Canada is now considering putting troops on the ground in Greenland, and the ripple effect is already disturbing the White House. What began as Donald Trump's latest tariff threat has escalated into a direct test of strength in the Arctic, and Ottawa is signaling that the future of the North will not be shaped by unilateral demands out of Washington.
What are you going to do about it, including adding to the military presence in Greenland?
It's a serious situation, and we're concerned. We're concerned about this escalation. I had conversations with the NATO Secretary General in Paris 10 days ago, within the past 2 weeks at least, about how we're going to further enhance that security umbrella. It's something that Canada is working on already and contributing to, when I say working on within the broader Arctic.
For weeks, tensions over Greenland have intensified. U.S. President Donald Trump, now in his second term, has revived his ambition to bring Greenland under American influence. He argues that the U.S. must secure the Arctic totally to counter rising global competition. And in private messages to European leaders, he has even tied this ambition to frustrations about not receiving the Nobel Peace Prize. Publicly, he threatened to impose a 10% tariff, rising to 25% by June, on 8 European allies unless they agree to negotiate the transfer of Greenland. Europe dismissed the ultimatum. Denmark warned it would not be blackmailed. Other European leaders echoed that rejection, insisting that Greenlandic self-determination and territorial integrity are not bargaining chips. And now, Canada has entered the picture in a way that changes the entire strategic equation. Ottawa is considering deploying a limited number of Canadian soldiers to Greenland as part of a NATO Arctic training mission alongside European partners. Officially, this exercise focuses on Arctic readiness and deterring foreign military activity in the region. But privately, senior officials acknowledge the timing is deliberate. Canada is sending a signal that no country, including the United States, has the right to reshape territorial realities in the North. The deployment would be modest, likely fewer than a dozen soldiers. Yet symbolism often outweighs scale, and that symbolism lands directly in the middle of Trump's strategy, because he has already warned that any ally sending troops to Greenland may face tariffs. That warning now applies to Canada. Under Prime Minister Mark Carney, Canada has embraced a sharper Arctic doctrine centered on sovereignty, rule of law, and collective security. Recent public briefings and government statements make clear that Ottawa sees Arctic stability as a shared responsibility, not a project dominated by any one country. This directly contradicts Trump's argument that American control is the only credible foundation for Arctic security. For Canada, Greenland is not a remote curiosity. It sits between two critical pillars of Canadian defense, NORAD to the south and the Canadian Arctic Archipelago to the west. Any attempt by a foreign power, even an ally, to absorb Greenland would redraw the Arctic security map and weaken Canada's strategic depth. That is something Carney cannot allow, especially after months of U.S. tariff pressure and the ongoing reshoring push that has pulled major auto investments out of Ontario. With the 2026 USMCA review approaching, Ottawa has no intention of letting Washington dictate the boundaries of North American security. Greenland has now become part of a larger pattern, Canada refusing to accept that the United States alone sets the rules of engagement in the North. Trump expected resistance from Europe. What he did not anticipate was Canada stepping directly into the fray. That decision undermines his Greenland strategy on several levels and complicates the narrative he has tried to build. First, it disrupts his vision of a united Western Hemisphere front. Trump has said repeatedly that North America must act as one bloc to confront rising global powers. But Canada's alignment with Europe on such a fundamental security question weakens the idea that Washington controls the Arctic agenda. Suddenly, North America is no longer marching in step. Second, Canada's involvement transforms the issue into a broader alliance matter. A dispute between Washington and Europe is one thing. A dispute involving Washington, Europe, and Canada creates the appearance of a coalition rejecting Trump's approach. When Canada steps in, the crisis no longer feels like Trump versus Denmark. It feels like Trump versus the entire Arctic security network. Third, it forces Trump into a strategic corner. If he retaliates economically against Canada for participating in a multilateral Arctic mission, he will be punishing a country that forms half of NORAD. In other words, he would be targeting the infrastructure that protects the U.S. homeland. Ottawa is fully aware of this contradiction. Trump cannot punish Canada without weakening the very defense framework he argues must be strengthened.
Canada already committing $6 billion to an over-the-horizon radar system for the far north.
We have to do more in our Arctic, but we also have to be kind of calm. More important thing is to work with our Arctic allies.
Canada's posture in the north has become noticeably more assertive. A multi-billion-dollar modernization of NORAD is underway. New radar systems are being developed, and air and sea patrol capability is expanding. Cooperation with Nordic states has also deepened as Arctic tensions have risen. Carney's doctrine is straightforward. Canada will not accept any attempt by any country to undermine Arctic sovereignty or destabilize existing territorial arrangements. Deploying troops to Greenland is the clearest physical expression of that doctrine so far. Public remarks from Danish and Greenlandic leaders make clear they welcome Allied involvement that reinforces defense and deterrence, but reject any form of coercion. Greenlandic officials have stated consistently that their right to self-determination is absolute. Danish authorities have also expressed appreciation for Canada's measured, rules-based approach at a moment when the political climate around Greenland has turned volatile. For Denmark, Canada is the ideal partner, an Arctic neighbor with no territorial ambitions and a strong commitment to shared security. If Trump decides to impose tariffs on Canada over a deployment that is coordinated with allies, the consequences could be significant. It would mean the United States is sanctioning a defense partner in the middle of a shared security mission. That would introduce political strain into NORAD at a moment when threats in the region are increasing. It could also accelerate Canada's shift toward economic diversification in Europe and Asia, a shift already underway after repeated tariff confrontations over the past year. The Greenland dispute would no longer be a distant diplomatic quarrel. It would become a direct blow to the Canada-US relationship months before the USMCA review. And for Canada, the stakes are personal. If the United States unilaterally dictates Greenland's future today, the fear is that nothing prevents it from attempting to dictate the future of Canada's Arctic tomorrow. That logic explains why Ottawa is preparing to act rather than wait. Canada's potential troop deployment to Greenland is not defined by its scale, it is defined by its message. It tells Europe that Canada is prepared to stand with its allies. It tells Denmark and Greenland that sovereignty is not something to be negotiated under pressure. And it tells Washington that the Arctic will not be shaped by unilateral demands. Trump envisioned a straightforward path: exert pressure, gain leverage, and secure Greenland. Instead, Canada's move risks turning his Arctic strategy into a geopolitical dead end. The only remaining question is whether Trump escalates further, or whether Ottawa and its allies have just forced him to reconsider the cost of pushing too far in the north. What is clear is that the Arctic is no longer quiet, and Canada is no longer watching from the sidelines.
U.S. network CBS is facing criticism for alleged political interference after a report on its flagship program, 60 Minutes, was pulled just hours before it was due to air last night. The segment was on a mega prison in El Salvador, where the U.S. has sent hundreds of mostly Venezuelan migrants without trial.
The question today is, was it pulled to placate Donald Trump? Now,
CBS pulled a fully approved 60 Minutes investigation just hours before airtime. The report exposed how the United States has been quietly flying vulnerable migrants to El Salvador and depositing them into CCOT, a mega prison so notorious it's described as a warehouse for the living dead. And just when America needed transparency the most, one of its biggest networks suddenly went dark. Tonight, we dig into why the story vanished, what it reveals about Trump's second term, and why Canada, under Mark Carney, is emerging as the steady hand North America desperately needs. All week long, CBS hyped its upcoming 60 Minutes report. Advertisements ran non-stop, teasers were pushed across platforms, viewers were primed for a major investigation into the fate of Venezuelan migrants deported without trial and marched straight into CCOT, a prison infamous for mass detentions and zero accountability. Everything was ready. CBS lawyers had approved the segment. Standards and Practices had signed off. The piece was edited, fact-checked, and placed on the Sunday schedule. Then the shock landed. Just a few hours before broadcast, Barry Weiss, the newly installed editor-in-chief, ordered the entire segment pulled. No detailed explanation, no postponement date, just a vague statement claiming the story wasn't the best it could be. Inside CBS, journalists were furious. Reporter Sharon Alphonse wrote an internal email saying exactly what everyone else feared. This is not an editorial decision, it's a political one. Reuters later confirmed that the Trump administration had been contacted repeatedly for comment and declined to participate, yet CBS still used that absence as justification to kill the report. The timing raised even more eyebrows. CBS's parent company, Skydance Media, is owned by David Ellison, whose father, Larry Ellison, is one of Trump's most influential supporters. Skydance is also in the middle of a major acquisition bid for Warner Bros., a deal that will ultimately need the blessing of the Trump administration. Suddenly, the idea that this was just an editorial choice seemed almost impossible to believe. The Washington Post, The Guardian, Reuters, and AP all reported the same conclusion. Something deeply unusual and deeply political had happened inside one of America's most iconic newsrooms.
In theory, American media prides itself on independence. In reality, moments like this expose a much darker truth. The White House doesn't need to call CBS and give orders. It doesn't need to send threats. When media ownership is tied to political benefit, when billion-dollar acquisitions depend on presidential approval, the pressure doesn't need to be spoken aloud. It's baked into every decision. A story that embarrasses the administration becomes a liability. A story about detainees treated like disposable cargo becomes a risk. And a story linking Trump's immigration crackdown to a foreign mega-prison becomes outright dangerous. That's why this moment matters. A powerful newsroom didn't collapse because of one executive. It collapsed because the political ecosystem surrounding Trump rewards silence and punishes scrutiny. This is how institutions erode, not overnight, but one censored segment at a time.
The CBS report centered on migrants who believed they were being sent back to Venezuela only to discover they were being redirected to El Salvador. Once there, they were shackled, paraded before cameras, and locked inside CCOT, a facility where prisoners reportedly remain indoors nearly 24 hours a day and have little to no legal recourse. One migrant told reporters, "We thought we were already the living dead." That sentence alone explains why this story mattered, and why its disappearance raised alarms far beyond the media world. The United States is not just deporting people, it is outsourcing the harshest parts of its immigration system to foreign governments with fewer checks, fewer protections, and almost no oversight. Instead of debating whether these policies are humane or legal, or even strategically sensible, the American public was denied the chance to even hear the truth. This saga unfolds against a backdrop of rising political turbulence in the United States. Trump's second term has seen aggressive deportation sweeps, legal battles with sanctuary cities, bitter internal divisions within federal agencies, and increasing scrutiny from international human rights groups. When CBS pulls a story at the last minute, it is not simply a newsroom controversy. It is a reflection of a larger pattern, institutions bending under political weight. The United States is showing signs of strain, legislative gridlock, judiciary conflicts, politicized agencies, and now a media sector uneasy about challenging power. If America once lectured the world about transparency and democratic resilience, it now struggles to fully demonstrate either. This is where Canada enters the conversation, not as a moral lecture, but as a contrast in governance. While the United States wrestles with political interference and institutional instability, Canada, under Mark Carney, is moving in the opposite direction. Canadian media outlets may debate fiercely and disagree loudly, but they do not pull investigative stories because shareholders fear political consequences. The norms are clearer, the pressure is lighter,
The trust is stronger. Canada does not rely on coercion or secrecy to manage its public narrative, and that difference matters. Carney's approach to migration also stands in stark contrast to Trump's. Canada enforces its borders, but it does so through transparent legal processes, partnerships with the UN, and a humanitarian model built on settlement and integration, not fear and deterrence. There are no hidden planes, no mega offshore prisons, no disappearing detainees. Even critics of Carney acknowledge that Canada's immigration model is rooted in due process rather than political theater. And while America's institutions wobble, Canada is investing in theirs. Carney is pushing for a more independent trade policy, expanding relations with Europe and Asia, and reinforcing the rule of law framework that anchors Canada's diplomacy. International observers increasingly see Canada as a predictable partner in an unpredictable region, a country that remains calm even when its southern neighbor is consumed by internal storms.
The CBS meltdown is not just a media scandal. It is a sign of where the United States is heading, toward a political environment where uncomfortable truths are postponed, softened, or erased. It is also a reminder that leadership is not measured only by power, but by how power treats those with none. Tonight's question is simple. When one country silences an investigation into human suffering while the other strengthens its democratic safeguards, which nation represents the future people will trust? Canada seems increasingly confident in its answer. America, once again, is struggling to find one. For years, Washington told the world that if companies wanted certainty, scale, and access, they had to go through the United States. Donald Trump just blew that model up. Today, two global automakers, Nissan and Volkswagen, are sending a quiet but unmistakable message. When Trump turns trade into a weapon, Canada starts to look like the safer bet. This is not about cars. This is about how Trump's tariffs are reshaping North America, and how Canada is turning U.S. volatility into a strategic advantage. Over the past few months, Nissan and Volkswagen have publicly signaled that they could expand their offerings in Canada, not by copying U.S. models, but by bringing in vehicles certified for Europe, Japan, and South Korea. Why does that matter? Because for decades, Canada aligned its vehicle safety standards almost perfectly with the United States. That alignment made the U.S. the regulatory gatekeeper for the entire North American auto market. Now, that gate is cracking. Canadian regulators are reviewing whether to decouple from U.S.-centric standards, opening the door to global vehicle platforms that never passed through Washington's approval process. And crucially, both Nissan and Volkswagen are backing that move. Their message is clear. Canada is no longer just a downstream extension of the U.S. auto market. It is becoming its own regulatory and commercial destination. This shift is happening against a very specific political backdrop. Donald Trump is in his second term as U.S. president. His administration has revived aggressive tariff threats, including 25% duties on imported vehicles and auto parts, while repeatedly signaling that trade policy will be used as leverage, not stability. In Ottawa, Prime Minister Mark Carney is responding with a different strategy: diversification, predictability, and reduced dependence on U.S. political mood swings. And global automakers are watching closely.
Let's be blunt. Automakers do not choose sides out of ideology. They choose risk profiles. Under Trump, the United States has become a high-volatility environment for global manufacturers. Tariffs can appear overnight. Exemptions can disappear just as fast. Trade policy is announced at rallies, on social media, or through last-minute executive threats. For companies that plan product cycles 5 to 10 years out, that is poison. This is where Canada quietly wins. Canada is offering something the U.S. currently cannot: regulatory calm.
By signaling openness to European and Asian vehicle standards, Ottawa is telling automakers you don't need to redesign your entire lineup just to survive Washington's politics. Nissan's comments are especially revealing. The company has openly acknowledged that Canada has demand for smaller, more affordable vehicles that the U.S. market does not prioritize. In the past, those models were blocked because they didn't fit U.S. certification logic. Trump didn't create that imbalance, but his tariffs made it impossible to ignore. Volkswagen's position reinforces the same logic. The company sells far more models globally than it is allowed to sell in Canada today. If Canada loosens its dependence on U.S. rules, Volkswagen gains immediate flexibility without expanding its exposure to American trade chaos. This is the key point many U.S. commentators miss. Trump's tariffs are not bringing jobs home. They are changing corporate math. When the cost of relying on the U.S. rises, companies don't always fight back. They reroute.
The United States still has scale. What it is losing under Trump is credibility. Canada, by contrast, is leaning into its reputation as a rules-based, predictable economy, even while standing firm against U.S. pressure. Ottawa has already shown it is willing to enforce trade agreements strictly, including against American firms that fall outside compliance frameworks. At the same time, Canada is accelerating trade and regulatory diversification across Europe and the Indo-Pacific. For automakers, this matters more than speeches. A vehicle approved under EU or Japanese standards can be sold across multiple global markets with minimal modification. A vehicle trapped inside U.S. certification logic cannot. By opening its system, Canada is effectively saying you don't have to choose between North America and the rest of the world anymore. That puts U.S. automakers in an uncomfortable position. A more open Canadian market disadvantages U.S.-only platforms, while rewarding companies with global supply chains. And that disadvantage is not caused by Canada. It is triggered by Trump's insistence on turning trade into a loyalty test. Ironically, this is exactly what Trump claims to oppose: America losing influence over global rules. Yet, here we are.
We've seen this movie before. Trump imposed tariffs on China and supply chains shifted to Southeast Asia. Trump threatened allies and trade blocs diversified. Now Trump escalates auto tariffs and Canada becomes the alternative hub. This is the pattern. Pressure without predictability produces exit, not obedience. Nissan and Volkswagen are not staging a protest, they are executing risk management. And that should worry Washington far more than any headline about foreign cars. Because once companies redesign their strategies around Canada, they don't simply snap back when the political mood changes. Regulatory independence is sticky. Market diversification compounds. What makes this shift more significant is timing. This is happening as the White House signals that tariffs are no longer a temporary tool, but a permanent feature of U.S. policy. For automakers, that distinction matters. Predictable costs can be managed, political volatility cannot. When trade rules change by headline, companies don't adjust pricing, they adjust geography. Canada is sending the opposite signal. Ottawa is modernizing regulations through consultation, not threats, and aligning with globally accepted standards rather than improvising policy. That tells boardrooms Canada is planning, not reacting. Once automakers build pathways that reduce dependence on U.S. volatility, they rarely reverse course. That quietly erodes Washington's leverage inside North America. Trump's strategy may raise pressure, but Canada's stability is what actually pulls investment. There's also a consumer consequence Washington is missing. If Canada opens its market to European and Asian models, Canadians gain more affordable choices, while U.S. buyers remain stuck with tariff-inflated prices. That gap reshapes demand over time. Trump's trade strategy raises costs at home, Canada's stability expands options. In the auto industry, that difference quietly determines where the future flows.
Donald Trump believes tariffs force loyalty. Canada understands that stability earns it. Nissan and Volkswagen didn't wake up one morning and choose Canada.
They responded to a system where U.S. policy has become unpredictable and Canadian policy has not. The result is a quiet but consequential shift. North America no longer revolves automatically around Washington. So here's the real question going forward. If Trump keeps exporting uncertainty, how many more industries will discover that Canada is the safer place to plan the future? Because once that realization sets in, it's not America first anymore. It's America optional.
We had a good update from Minister LeBlanc. He just gave us a bit the state of play in the way that, things are complex. I think Canadians have understood that. But also looking what happened with our colleagues in Mexico, the discussion in the United States. I mean, the focus today was really to see what's coming, but also to focus on what we can control.
Canada's finance minister just sent Washington a message it didn't expect. Trade talks under CUSMA are still ongoing, but Canada is no longer structuring its future around American unpredictability. While Donald Trump publicly claims he's ending trade negotiations, Ottawa is quietly doing something far more consequential. It is preparing for a world where U.S. volatility is no longer Canada's defining risk. This is not a moment of panic. It is a moment of recalibration. This week, Canada's Finance Minister, François-Philippe Champagne, confirmed that discussions under CUSMA, the North American Trade Agreement, are continuing with the United States. His remarks followed high-level meetings with provincial finance ministers, the Bank of Canada, and Canada's trade leadership, all focused on preparing for the mandatory CUSMA review scheduled for 2026. The timing matters. Donald Trump is now in his second term as U.S. president, once again turning trade policy into a political weapon. Washington has floated ideas ranging from sector-by-sector agreements to openly questioning whether CUSMA should even survive in its current form. Public statements from the White House suggest trade talks are over, even as behind-the-scenes conversations continue. Champagne's message was deliberately calm. Canada understands the environment it is operating in. The United States is unpredictable. Policy signals change quickly, and negotiations increasingly play out in public rather than through quiet diplomacy. The question is no longer whether Canada can control U.S. behavior. The question is how Canada insulates itself from it. The contrast between Ottawa and Washington could not be clearer. Trump governs trade through shock. Canada governs trade through preparation. Champagne openly acknowledged what Canadian officials no longer pretend otherwise. Canada cannot control policy south of the border. Under Trump, tariffs appear and disappear without warning. Long-standing agreements are treated as leverage rather than commitments. Political theater often replaces economic logic. But instead of reacting to every threat, Canada has chosen to slow the game down. Champagne emphasized that roughly 85% of Canada-U.S. trade remains exempt under CUSMA, giving Canada the lowest effective cost of entry into the U.S. market among major trading partners. That is not a talking point. It is strategic breathing room. It allows Canada to keep trading while quietly adjusting its long-term posture. More importantly, Canada is no longer pretending that preferential access to the U.S. market is a permanent guarantee. The language coming from Ottawa has shifted. The focus is no longer on dependence, but on durability, not on proximity, but on options. This is not anti-American, it is pro-Canadian. Champagne did not downplay the damage caused by tariffs. He spoke directly about workers who feel the impact most sharply. Steel workers in Hamilton, auto workers in Oshawa, forestry communities, farmers and fishers across the country. The pain is real and it is uneven. Tariffs hit specific sectors harder than others, even when those sectors are deeply integrated into U.S. supply chains. That is the paradox of Trump's trade policy. It claims to protect American industry while actively disrupting the North American production system that keeps those industries competitive. Canada is not denying that reality. Unlike Washington, Ottawa is not pretending tariffs are painless or temporary. The government has focused on targeted support for affected industries while accelerating structural changes that reduce exposure to future shocks.
That includes strengthening domestic supply chains, investing in advanced manufacturing, securing critical minerals, and positioning Canada as a stable energy and technology partner in a volatile global economy. These are not short-term fixes, they are long-term insurance policies. One of the most revealing moments in Champagne's remarks had little to do with the United States directly. He pointed to growing international interest in Canada from Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Countries and investors are seeking stability, predictability, and rule of law at a time when global uncertainty is higher than it was during the 2008 financial crisis. Canada is benefiting from that contrast. While Washington debates tariffs and threats, Canada is hosting G7 meetings, deepening economic and security ties with allies, and attracting investment precisely because it does not govern by impulse. In a world where trade is increasingly linked to national security and political alignment, Canada's reputation matters. Trump's America sells leverage and confrontation. Canada sells consistency and credibility. That difference is quietly reshaping how global partners view North America. There is no illusion in Ottawa about what lies ahead. The 2026 USMA review will be contentious. Washington may threaten withdrawal. Tariffs may resurface as negotiating tools. Public pressure campaigns will intensify. But Canada enters that process more prepared than it was during Trump's first term. It has diversified trade relationships, it has reinforced domestic resilience, and it has learned that reacting emotionally to U.S. pressure only strengthens it. Experience has replaced anxiety. Champagne's tone reflected that confidence. Canada will continue to engage the United States. It will continue to defend its interests, but it will no longer assume that stability automatically flows from proximity. The relationship is evolving whether Washington likes it or not. There's a quieter shift happening beneath Washington's noise. Every time U.S. trade policy swings with politics, Canada gains something valuable: credibility. Global partners and investors respond to stability, not volume. Canada is positioning itself as a reliable anchor in areas where uncertainty now carries real costs, from energy security and critical minerals to advanced manufacturing and artificial intelligence. These are not talking points, they are active conversations with allies who want supply chains that survive political cycles. Champagne's focus on controlling what Canada can control reflects that reality. As Canada removes internal trade barriers, strengthens domestic production, and deepens markets beyond the United States, its leverage improves naturally, not through confrontation, but through options. The United States remains Canada's largest trading partner, but it is no longer the only pillar supporting Canada's economic future. That changes the tone of every negotiation heading into the USMA review. When alternatives exist, pressure loses its edge. Donald Trump believes pressure forces compliance. Canada is demonstrating something else entirely. Pressure forces adaptation. Cosmic may still be ongoing, but Canada's economic future is no longer hostage to American mood swings. If the United States wants a stable, integrated North American economy, Canada remains a willing partner. If not, Canada is already building alternatives. As 2026 approaches, the real question is not whether Canada is ready. It is whether Washington understands that the leverage it once relied on is quietly slipping away, because this time Canada is not flinching.